Good of you to join us, Alucard.
Father.
2010's Castlevania Lords of Shadow was something of a surprise to say the least. Not only did it live up to the immense hype that had been built up around it prior to its launch, receiving mostly critical acclaim, it was also a financial success for Konami, becoming the best-selling entry in the Castlevania franchise at that time. In my last video, I explored how developer Mercurysteam had managed to do what had been considered somewhat impossible: translate the series from its 2D origins into full 3D. Borrowing from earlier titles like Castlevania 4 and the God of War series, Lords of Shadow rebooted the franchise with a new identity and mythology, with the biggest surprise being that it was actually an origin story for the series' antagonist Dracula, revealed to be Gabriel Belmont in this new take. This of course then begged the question, where do you take the series after this? According to producer Dave Cox, the success of Lords of Shadow had come somewhat as a surprise to Mercurysteam, and that there were no immediate plans for a sequel, outside of the idea of doing a 2D title. From the little information available, the studio quietly began work on what would eventually become the first sequel, Castlevania Lords of Shadow Mirror of Fate, possibly as a self-funded project. Konami would eventually give the green light for Lords of Shadow 2 following the success of the first game, and it would seem that at this point the studio split into two different teams, given the very close release dates of Mirror of Fate and Lords of Shadow 2. I say this is likely due to this game having a different director. Lords of Shadow 1 and 2 were directed by the studio lead, Enrique Alvarez, while Mirror of Fate is directed by Jose Marquez. This is similar to how Naughty Dog split off into two teams after Uncharted 2, to work on Uncharted 3 and The Last of Us respectively. Again, according to Dave Cox, Mirror of Fate was originally designed with consoles in mind before the decision was made to rework it and release it for what would be a timed exclusive on the Nintendo 3DS in March 2013. The game would then be re-released in HD on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 in October that year, and finally on PC in March 2014, not long after Lords of Shadow 2. Interestingly, Mercurysteam would work with Nintendo again later on developing the remake of Metroid 2 Samus Returns in 2017. The reception to Mirror of Fate was definitely a bit more mixed than the first game, with some enjoying it while others, IGN in particular, no surprises there, really hating it, calling it drab and boring with a story that was apparently convoluted and obtusely delivered. The game was also a bit unfairly, in my opinion, heavily compared to Symphony of the Night. So with all this in mind, let's take a closer look at Castlevania Mirror of Fate, shall we?
I know why you have come.
I think from the title screen, Mirror of Fate is making a bit of a statement with just this one image. The castle can be seen very clearly, almost as if to say to the people who had complained that Lords of Shadow didn't feel much like a Castlevania game, that this game will be a return to form in some way, namely being set entirely in the castle. Mirror of Fate is set 57 years after the events of the first game. In a brief prologue as Gabriel, which serves as a tutorial, we learn that his wife Marie had a son while he was gone. The Brotherhood of Light had seen Gabriel's eventual fate through a fragment of the titular Mirror of Fate, taking the child to be raised as a warrior in secret, as only the bloodline of the Belmonts could ever hope to defeat him later.
Will you suffer the same fate?
The story is then split up across 3 acts and 3 playable characters: Simon Belmont, Alucard, and Trevor Belmont, who each explore different areas of the castle over the course of the game. As you can see from the footage, Mirror of Fate returns to the classic 2D style of older Castlevania games, except now rendered in full 3D, or 2.5D, which is a style I'm actually quite fond of in games like Tombi or the recent Bloodstained. The art direction I feel here is the key and what really makes this game stand apart visually from the other games in the franchise. Despite the 2D nature, the art team and level designers have really managed to make this castle feel huge, with the camera often panning out to reveal massive fortress doors, giant statues, and numerous environmental details that really pop off the screen. A lot of care, it seems, was put into trying to make each area feel unique and distinct from each other, with some areas being more run down than others, and some of the exterior areas are actually shown to still be in construction. One of my biggest issues with PS2 titles was that the level design felt like a lot of copy and paste was done with its rooms and halls. Thankfully, that's not the case here. Like the first game, a lot of the fun can be found in just wondering what kind of vista you'll find next. The gameplay itself is something of a hybrid between classic Metroidvania exploration with the tighter combat focus of the first Lords of Shadow game, though overall it does feel much closer to a classic Castlevania.
That makes things far more interesting.
Back from the classic games is the inclusion of hearts being used to power your sub-weapons, simplifying the design of the first game where each individual sub-weapon had its own storage amount to upgrade. Now it's just the heart's capacity. All three characters have their own unique sub-weapons, as well as magic abilities. Simon has a very effective throwing axe, which is good for flying enemies, and also a firebomb, though I tended to stick with the axes. Alucard has a somewhat useful bat swarm that attacks enemies that I feel becomes overshadowed by his second sub-weapon, which is the stopwatch that slows down time for about 10 seconds. Trevor is then equipped with a boomerang, and finally gets his hand on the best sub-weapon in the game, the electric bomb that stuns and damages enemies. The magic system is also reworked this time, now with only one magic gauge instead of two, and magic orbs are now dropped by defeated enemies instead of needing to maintain a focus meter, though like the first game, each character has a defensive and offensive magic ability. For Simon, it's the Balnada spirit, which makes him invincible, and the Schneider spirit that attacks enemies, with the name being a reference to a character from Castlevania 64, Michael Gerhard Schneider, which itself was a reference to Metal Gear Solid. Alucard's abilities are a direct homage to his abilities from Symphony of the Night, with both his Mist and Wolf forms returning. These are both used to access new areas and aid in combat, with Mist restoring health when phasing through enemies, and the Wolf form doing increased damage. Trevor's magic is identical to Gabriel's from the first game, restoring health and doing more damage with each hit, depending on the magic activated. Each character also unlocks an initially unique upgrade that helps them with exploration throughout the castle, and encourages backtracking previous areas to find hidden health and magic upgrades. Simon starts off with the leather whip, but eventually finds his own combat cross that allows him to grapple and swing across chasms. Alucard gains demonic wings, which allow him to double jump and glide, whilst Trevor acquires the speed boots that allow him to sprint jump over long distances.
Worthy of the name Belmont.
All of this is then combined with the returning combat of the first Lords of Shadow, with a number of different combos to unlock that do a pretty good job mimicking the look of that game's combat in this new 2D plane. The difference is that instead of earning experience points to then spend on which combos you wanted, the game automatically unlocks them for you with a more traditional level up system. Mirror of Fate also features returning Castlevania enemies like mermen, gargoyles, harpies, along with new brute type enemies like the executioners and possessed armors. They even brought back the animated books from Symphony that now buff up enemies. However, there are no Medusa heads in this game, which I honestly think is for the best, as they are easily the most irritating enemy from the classic games. Another notable difference is the fact that QuickTime events are much less prominent in Mirror of Fate, with now only a handful QTE moments for doors and certain attacks requiring button mashing to escape. There are only two boss fights that utilize QTEs, interestingly both as Trevor and are towards the end of the game that are quite forgiving due to the game's autosave feature, which prevents huge losses of progress and removes the need for save rooms like other Metroidvanias. Puzzles also make a return in Mirror of Fate, and much like the first game, they are usually solved in the one room. I think there was only one fetch quest for keys in Alucard's chapter. The puzzles are all fairly logical. There's nothing obtuse here like was seen in Symphony of the Night, where you had to activate the stopwatch in the clock tower to unlock a passage that contained the rest of the bloody game, nor do you need to find a specific key item before fighting a particular boss that might otherwise end the game prematurely without it. And there is no goddamn Chupacabra puzzle in this game. Thank the Prince of Darkness.
Thank you so much for this infinite kindness. I don't know how to thank you enough.
Overall, this is a much more streamlined Metroidvania experience, and I feel that it was never designed with the ambition of being a Symphony of the Night killer, more that it was trying to evoke a familiar feeling for fans whilst maintaining its new mythology and gameplay style. It's not perfect though, and here I'm going to be diving into spoiler territory, so here is a warning if you haven't played Mirror of Fate yet.
You gave me your word.
The first issue I have with Mirror of Fate is the multiple character approach, and how it's been executed here. Having multiple playable characters isn't new for the franchise at all, with Castlevania 64 and Portrait of Ruin offering 2 different characters to choose from, as well as other games having unlockable characters to play as. The issue here with Mirror of Fate is that, outside of their different magic abilities, all 3 characters are fundamentally the same. They all use a whip and share the same combos, but also all of the experience and upgrades you find carry over to the next character when you play as them, which I guess is a way to encourage you to go for that 100% exploration rating, which isn't too difficult to be honest. I did it in 10 hours for my playthrough for this video. I think it could have been neat if Alucard had instead used a sword and had his own unique set of attack animations. They could have then included a little side story of how he discovers his sword, the Crusade Room, that he uses in Lords of Shadow 2. However, I get the sense that if this game had indeed been self-funded before Konami greenlit Lords of Shadow 2, a smaller budget would seem to be a reasonable explanation for why this wasn't the case. It just makes the characters feel a little bit less unique than they could have been. Going back to how the game is split across 3 separate character acts, each with their own sections of the castle to explore, this kind of ends up making the overall exploration feel a bit fragmented when compared to other Metroidvania games. One of the coolest parts of the earlier titles, or games like Dark Souls, is exploring one big interconnected world, and going back to earlier areas much stronger. This feeling doesn't really translate into Mirror of Fate. You never quite get the feeling like you're getting to explore the entire castle, which can be a little disappointing as there's only a little bit of overlap in the areas that are shared between the characters. This is largely due to the game's story and structure however, as Simon and Alucard's stories occur at the same time. Trevor, meanwhile, has his set 30 years before that. The story begins with Simon, who, after being raised in the mountains by a warrior tribe after Dracula's hordes destroyed his village and killed his mother Cypher, travels to the castle seeking revenge. Whilst venturing through the castle, guided by the Mirror of Fate and a mysterious entity known as the Lost Soul, Simon encounters a vampire known as Alucard who comes to his aid a few times and promises him that he won't face Dracula alone. Alucard is shown to have only just arisen from a presumed death and is horrified at the realization that he is now a vampire. The two eventually meet at the throne room and confront Dracula in an Alucard-controlled boss fight. In some ways, I kind of felt the sequence undermined Simon a little bit, and made it a bit more about Alucard and what he was going through. Simon does end up being the one who kills Dracula though, and Alucard notes that his death wasn't how regular vampires die. Simon asks Alucard one time to tell him who he is, and still receives no real answer. The final act is set 30 years earlier, and 27 years after the events of the first game. The Brotherhood of Light finally reveals to Trevor how his mother died and who Gabriel has become. Saying his goodbyes to Cypher and bestowing the mirror onto his son Simon, Trevor vows to avenge his mother. Once he gets to the castle, Trevor is shown to actually be a little bit of a dick, ignoring the advice from the Lost Soul and actually attacking him.
You're a cockwart, Alucard.
After finally confronting Dracula and losing, Trevor uses his dying breaths to reveal that he is in fact Gabriel's son. The Mirror of Fate confirms Trevor's story to Gabriel, who is horrified by this revelation, and attempts seemingly in vain to revive him with his own blood. Never learning his name, he dubs Trevor Alucard, as he buries him in the room with the mirror, vowing vengeance upon humanity and the Brotherhood. Really, IGN? You thought this story was convoluted and obtuse? Despite the predictable twist of Trevor becoming Alucard, I still found this end sequence to be tragically beautiful, and provided great character motivation for Gabriel to fully give over to the Dracula persona, given how he has now been tricked into killing both his wife and his son.
No! No! My son.
Not everyone liked this twist. Some were disappointed that Trevor and Alucard became the same person, because in Dracula's Curse they were separate characters, but honestly I was fine with it, because this is a brand new mythology. It was also consistent with the original lore of Alucard being Dracula's son. Putting it all together then, I found Castlevania Mirror of Fate as a whole to be an enjoyable experience, and one that I find myself coming back to at least once a year or so. There's something about Mercurysteam's art direction with the 2.5D style that I find consistently appealing, and in some ways better than the recent Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. It's also a fairly short game too, which for me makes it much easier to revisit than the first game, which, as I pointed out in the last video, is a really long game. The game does have its shortcomings, and its more streamlined nature hold it back somewhat from being as good as other Metroidvania games out there, but I still think Mirror of Fate is a very fun game and worth checking out. It's easily available on PlayStation 3 and Xbox, as well as on Steam for PC. Out of the Lords of Shadow trilogy, I would honestly have to say that Mirror of Fate is my favourite to revisit. Which now just leaves the final game, Lords of Shadow 2, and that is going to be a long video, and an interesting game to discuss, as I'm currently playing it again for the first time in 6 years, which is a long time for opinions to possibly change, so I look forward to that. My next video, however, is going to be a Last of Us themed video to coincide with the 1 year anniversary of Part 2, and so I can have a brief break from writing about Castlevania. I hope you enjoyed this retrospective look at Castlevania Mirror of Fate, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing, or you can support my work further on Patreon, though there is no pressure whatsoever. Stay safe everyone, and stay retro.